The documents arrived at 3:17 in the morning, encrypted, untraceable, containing satellite imagery that shouldn't exist, and financial records that paint a picture so disturbing, so methodically orchestrated, that sleep became impossible. What you're about to hear represents 18 months of investigation into a web of connections spanning 7 decades, 3 continents, and technologies that officially don't exist. The first anomaly appeared in the purchasing records of a major defense contractor. Between 1997 and 2003, they acquired 17 seemingly unrelated companies: a water treatment facility in Colorado, a seed bank in Norway, a rare earth mining operation in Mongolia, a pharmaceutical research lab in Switzerland. On the surface, diversification, dig deeper and a pattern emerges that defies coincidence. Each acquisition followed the same timeline. First, a sudden change in leadership, key personnel replaced within 60 days. Second, immediate relocation of core research to undisclosed facilities. Third, the complete digitization and subsequent disappearance of all historical records. Fourth, integration into a subsidiary network so complex that tracing ownership requires forensic accounting software typically reserved for international money laundering investigations. The water treatment facility was the breakthrough. Before acquisition, they specialized in municipal filtration systems, standard technology. After the buyout, their power consumption increased by 400%, while their water output decreased by 60%. The facility now operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no public records of what they're treating or where the processed water goes. Thermal satellite data reveals underground construction that began immediately after the acquisition. The excavation signature suggests a facility extending at least 12 stories below ground level. More troubling, the electromagnetic emissions from the site match patterns associated with particle acceleration technology, the kind used in advanced physics experiments that require massive energy inputs and generate radiation signatures typically associated with nuclear research. The Norwegian seed bank presents an even more disturbing picture. Officially, they preserve agricultural biodiversity. Privately obtained manifests tell a different story. Since 2004, they've been systematically collecting and storing genetic material from every major food crop on Earth. But here's what doesn't make sense. They're not just preserving existing varieties, they're cataloging genetic modifications that don't appear in any public research database. Cross-referencing the modifications with patent filings reveals something extraordinary. Each alteration corresponds to specific environmental conditions: increased radiation tolerance, enhanced growth in low-oxygen atmospheres, resistance to synthetic compounds that don't currently exist in nature, as if they're preparing for environmental conditions that haven't occurred yet. The pharmaceutical research lab in Switzerland provides the final piece of this particular puzzle. Their post-acquisition research focuses exclusively on what they term adaptation medicine, drugs designed to help human physiology cope with extreme environmental changes. The research notes, obtained through a source who requested anonymity, describe preparations for atmospheric composition shifts, increased radiation exposure, and food supply disruptions. When mapped together, these 3 facilities form what can only be described as a survival infrastructure: water processing for unknown purposes, food production adapted for hostile environments, pharmaceutical interventions for human adaptation to extreme conditions. The question becomes unavoidable: what do they know that we don't? The answer emerged from an unexpected source: a former employee of the rare earth mining operation in Mongolia. Someone who spent 3 years working 12-hour shifts extracting specific mineral combinations that have no known commercial application. According to testimony provided under condition of anonymity, the mining operation focused on lithium compounds, rare earth elements, and something called crystalline substrate materials. The mining data reveals extraction patterns that mirror the energy signatures found at the Colorado facility. Both operations show the same 24-hour cycles, the same electromagnetic emissions, and the same inexplicable power consumption levels. More significantly, shipping manifests show regular transfers of extracted materials from Mongolia to Colorado, then processed outputs shipped to locations that don't appear on any mapping system. Following the shipping routes required techniques typically used to track international arms dealing. Shell companies layered within shell companies. Freight forwarding through countries with minimal shipping oversight. Final destinations obscured through customs documentation that technically complies with international law while providing no actual information about cargo contents or ultimate purpose. The breakthrough came from analyzing global shipping data over the past 15 years. The pattern becomes unmistakable when viewed at scale. Every 6 months, coordinated shipments move from extraction sites to processing facilities to final destinations. The timing corresponds precisely with solar activity cycles, atmospheric disturbance patterns, and what climatologists euphemistically term irregularities in global weather systems. But the most disturbing discovery lies in the historical analysis. This isn't new. Reviewing declassified documents from the 1950s reveals nearly identical patterns of acquisition, research, and facility development. The same corporate structures, the same research focuses, the same systematic preparation for undefined environmental challenges. The difference is scale. What began as isolated research projects in the post-war era has evolved into a global infrastructure network. Facilities on every continent, research partnerships with institutions in over 40 countries, financial resources that dwarf the gross domestic product of most nations. The second emotional shift occurs when you realize the timeline implications. If preparation began 70 years ago, if the current acceleration started in the late 90s, if the integration phase is approaching completion, then whatever they're preparing for isn't theoretical, it's imminent. Evidence for this timeline comes from multiple sources. Atmospheric monitoring stations show consistent anomalies beginning in 2008. Seismic data reveals underground activity patterns that correlate with the facility construction timeline. Most significantly, global climate data shows acceleration in environmental changes that exceed even the most aggressive scientific projections. The facilities aren't responding to these changes, they preceded them by decades. Connecting these dots requires examining the relationship between environmental monitoring and industrial development. For the past 20 years, major corporations have systematically acquired weather monitoring stations, atmospheric research facilities, and climate data collection networks, not to study climate change but to prepare for specific environmental conditions that their own research predicted. The leaked documents include climate modeling data that has never appeared in public scientific discourse, projections that account for factors not included in official climate research, atmospheric composition changes, electromagnetic field variations, solar radiation patterns that deviate from historical norms. The models predict environmental conditions that would make current agricultural systems impossible, current population centers uninhabitable, and current industrial infrastructure obsolete. Unless you're prepared, unless you have underground facilities with independent power systems, unless you have genetic modifications that allow food production in hostile environments, unless you have pharmaceutical interventions that allow human survival in conditions that would otherwise prove fatal. The preparation isn't just technological, it's social. Analyzing demographic data from areas surrounding major facilities reveals systematic population changes, higher education levels, specific skill sets, age distributions that suggest selective recruitment, employment patterns that indicate long-term residential commitments rather than temporary project assignments. These aren't industrial facilities, they're closed communities designed for extended isolation, complete with housing, medical facilities, educational systems, and recreational infrastructure. Self-contained societies prepared to operate independently of external resources or support systems. The financial structure supporting this infrastructure reveals the final layer of the conspiracy. Funding comes from sources that technically don't exist, investment vehicles with no traceable ownership, holding companies incorporated in jurisdictions with no disclosure requirements. Revenue streams that appear to violate basic economic principles by generating profits from activities that produce no measurable products or services. Following the money leads to the international banking system's most closely guarded secret. There are accounts that don't appear on any official records, transactions that process through systems designed for sovereign wealth management but operated by entities with no governmental affiliation. Capital flows that exceed the combined reserves of major national banks while leaving no audit trail or regulatory footprint. The scale of these hidden financial resources becomes clear when cross-referenced with known facility construction costs. Underground development costs approximately $50 million per square mile. The identified facility network represents over 300 square miles of underground construction. Simple mathematics suggests an investment exceeding $15 billion over the past 2 decades. That's minimum. The actual figure likely exceeds $50 billion when accounting for research and development, equipment acquisition, ongoing operational costs, and what internal documents refer to as population integration expenses. The third and most profound emotional shift occurs when examining what they consider the optimal outcome. Internal strategic planning documents outline scenarios where global population decreases by 80% within 50 years. Not through catastrophic events but through what they term managed transition processes. The managed transition concept appears throughout facility planning documents, infrastructure designed to support specific population levels, agricultural systems scaled for predetermined consumption requirements, medical facilities equipped for particular demographic profiles, resource allocation models that assume systematic population reduction rather than growth management. These aren't emergency preparations. They're implementation plans for a deliberately orchestrated future state. The evidence suggests coordination at levels that challenge basic assumptions about how global systems operate. Major governments appear to be aware of and actively supporting the infrastructure development. International regulatory agencies have systematically revised oversight requirements to accommodate facility operations. Scientific institutions have redirected research priorities to align with preparation objectives. The coordination extends to information management. Academic research that contradicts official projections faces systematic funding cuts. Media coverage of environmental monitoring data focuses exclusively on gradual change rather than threshold events. Public policy discussions deliberately exclude consideration of adaptation infrastructure even when such discussions would be logically relevant. Most troubling, the pattern suggests that opposition isn't just discouraged, but anticipated and prepared for. Facility security measures exceed those typically associated with industrial installations. Personnel screening processes mirror those used for intelligence operations. Communication systems operate independently of civilian infrastructure and maintain capabilities during conditions that would disable conventional networks. The implications become clear when viewing current global events through this framework. Environmental disasters that seem random follow patterns consistent with the facility research models. Economic disruptions that appear chaotic serve to consolidate resources under centralized control structures. Political developments that seem irrational create conditions favorable to systematic population management initiatives. What appears to be incompetence or coincidence reveals itself as methodical implementation of long-term strategic objectives. The countdown becomes visible when analyzing recent acceleration in facility completion schedules. Projects initially planned for 20-year timelines are being compressed into 5-year completion windows. Personnel recruitment has intensified. Resource stockpiling has increased exponentially. Communication protocols have shifted from development planning to operational readiness. The most significant indicator lies in the pharmaceutical research timeline. Adaptation medicine development has reached clinical trial phases for conditions that don't currently exist, unless they know something about future environmental conditions that hasn't been shared with the general population. Recent atmospheric monitoring data provides disturbing confirmation. Composition changes that the models predicted for 2030 are occurring in 2025. Electromagnetic field variations that shouldn't manifest for another decade are measurable today. Solar radiation patterns that represent unprecedented deviations from historical norms began in 2023 and are accelerating. The timeline isn't theoretical anymore, it's operational. Evidence for immediate implementation comes from facility activity patterns over the past 18 months. Power consumption has increased by 300%. Personnel movements suggest transition from construction to operational phases. Supply shipments have shifted from equipment delivery to consumable stockpiling patterns consistent with extended isolation periods. Most significantly, the communication intercepts reveal coordination for what they term the convergence event. A synchronized transition point where all facilities shift from preparation to implementation protocols simultaneously. The timing indicators suggest convergence within the next 24 months. The final revelation comes from analyzing their definition of success. Internal assessment metrics don't measure prevention of environmental catastrophe or population survival rates. They measure efficiency of resource utilization under post-transition conditions, effectiveness of population management systems during convergence implementation, sustainability of operational infrastructure in isolation mode. They're not trying to prevent what's coming. They're optimizing their position for what they've determined is inevitable. The facility network represents the largest and most sophisticated survival infrastructure ever constructed, hidden in plain sight, financed through systems designed to avoid detection, staffed by personnel recruited through processes that ensure loyalty and competence, equipped with technology that exceeds public sector capabilities by decades. When viewed in totality, The evidence points to a conclusion that challenges fundamental assumptions about how global systems operate, who controls them, and what they're ultimately designed to achieve. The infrastructure exists, the resources are committed, the timeline is accelerating. What began as corporate diversification reveals itself as systematic preparation for global transformation. What appeared to be environmental research proves to be adaptation planning for predetermined conditions. What seemed like isolated industrial development represents coordinated implementation of humanity's most ambitious and terrifying undertaking. The facilities are ready, the personnel are trained, the resources are secured, the timeline is operational. The question that remains is simple and profound. When the convergence event begins, where will you be? The answer to that question may determine whether you experience what's coming as a participant or as a statistic in someone else's optimization model. The evidence is documented. The pattern is clear. The timeline is accelerating. What you do with this information may be the most important decision you ever make. Time is running out.